As the days grew warmer, her restlessness deepened. He could feel it, even when she smiled, even when her laughter filled the cabin like music. There was a distance creeping in around the edges of her joy, a softness that carried goodbye in its shadow. She'd stand by the window after sunset, watching the forest shimmer with the last light, and sometimes whisper things in her own tongue, words that sounded like prayers or promises. When Rylan asked what they meant, she would only say, "Old things, things that fade if not spoken." Then, one morning, the quiet was broken by a sound unlike any that had touched the valley in months, a horn, low and distant, echoing through the trees like a voice from another world. Rylan straightened where he stood, axe in hand, and turned toward the sound. Liara froze mid-step, her ears twitching sharply. For a moment, her face went utterly still. "You hear that?" he asked. She nodded slowly, her gaze distant. "It's a clan horn," she whispered. "A call from my kind." The second tone followed, closer, more insistent. Rylan's chest tightened. "They found you," he said quietly. "Or they want you to come back." She swallowed hard, her tail lowering. Maybe both. For a long time, neither spoke. The horn faded, leaving the forest eerily still. Then Liara said softly, "They wouldn't have come this far unless they meant to find me." "Do you want to see them?" Rylan asked. Her ears drooped slightly, her voice trembling on the edge of truth. "I don't know. Part of me does. Another part," she trailed off, eyes flicking toward him. "Another part doesn't want to leave what I found here." He nodded slowly. "Then don't decide yet. Let them come to you." By midday, 3 vulpine figures emerged from the forest, their forms ghost-like through the lingering mist. 2 were young, their fur pale as dawnlight, but the one in front moved with the weight of age and authority. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, their sharp eyes scanning the cabin before settling on Liara, who stood tall and still beside Rylan. "Liara of the Dawnclaw," the elder said, his voice rough but steady. "We have searched through winter for your trail." "And now you've found it," she replied evenly. "Why?" The old fox bowed his head. "The alpha who cast you out is gone. The clans are scattered, leaderless. We seek to rebuild what was lost, and we remember your courage." One of the younger vulpines stepped forward, golden fur catching the sun. "We thought perhaps you would return, not to kneel," she added quickly, "but to guide." Liara's ears twitched, her expression unreadable. "Guide?" she echoed. "You want the outcast to lead?" "The outcast who refused to bow," the elder corrected. "We need one who remembers choice." The words struck her like a heartbeat, deep and resonant. She turned toward Rylan then, and in her eyes he saw everything. Pride, confusion, longing, love. "And if I refuse again?" she asked. The elder's voice softened. "Then the forest still welcomes you? But your people wish to learn what made you stronger." Liara looked down, her hands curling lightly at her sides. "It wasn't power," she said quietly. "It was kindness." The vulpines followed her gaze toward Rylan, and in that shared silence the truth became clear. The elder nodded once, slow and respectful. "Then the wild owes him a debt." "He'd never take it," she said. "Nor should he. Some gifts are meant to stay unspoken." The old one smiled faintly, his eyes like molten amber. "Then may your home stand between both worlds. Fox Queen." He turned, his companions following, and within moments the forest swallowed them once more. When they were gone, the quiet returned, heavy but not cold. Liara stood unmoving for a long while before speaking. "They didn't demand I return," she said softly. "They asked me to teach." "Guess they learned something from you after all," Rylan said. She turned to face him, her golden eyes full of warmth. "Maybe they saw what I found," she murmured. "Someone who listens." He met her gaze, steady and unguarded. "And someone who taught me that peace doesn't mean silence." She smiled faintly. "We make a good pair, human." "We do," he said. That evening they sat on the porch as the sun bled across the horizon, the world glowing in shades of amber and rose. The wind carried the scent of thawed earth and pine sap, and fireflies drifted lazily among the shadows. Liara leaned against him, her head finding its familiar place on his shoulder. "So," he murmured, "what will you teach them first?" She didn't hesitate. "Choice," she said softly. "That no one, not even an alpha, owns another's will." Rylan smiled, his arm resting lightly around her. "Good lesson." "You taught it first," she whispered, her tail curling gently around them both. As dusk deepened, the forest began to sing, the river murmuring, the trees whispering, the first night birds calling to one another. It was as if the world itself had found harmony again. Liara turned her face toward him, her voice no louder than the breath of wind. "Do you remember when we met?" she asked. "You told me I could choose." "Still true," he said. "Always will be." "Then I choose this," she murmured. Her hand found his, fingers twining like roots beneath the soil. For all the seasons ahead. They sat there long after the stars appeared, watching the last light fade from the mountains. Somewhere beyond, the clans rebuilt, the rivers thawed, and the world moved forward. But in that small cabin at the edge of the forest, time slowed. holding its breath for two souls who had once been exiled by their worlds and now had found belonging in each other. When at last they rose to go inside, the night greeted them like an old friend. The fire burned low, casting soft light over the carvings on the mantel, the fox, the human, the braided talisman that swayed gently in the warm air. Liara touched it lightly before turning toward him. "Do you think it's enough?" she asked. "What we've built? It's more than enough," he said. "It's real." She smiled then, the kind of smile that reached her eyes and stayed there. "And that's all I ever wanted." Outside, spring continued its slow awakening. The snow that had once divided sky and soil was gone, replaced by the living pulse of the earth. And as dawn crept over the horizon, painting the world in light, two figures stood together by the window, one human, one fox, watching the forest breathe. Exile had given them silence. Love had turned it into song. In the soft glow of morning, Liara pressed her forehead against his, her whisper barely more than breath. "You were never my alpha," she said. "You were my choice." Rylan smiled, his hand resting over hers. "And you were the reason I stopped running." The wind moved through the trees, carrying with it the scent of new blossoms, the memory of winter, and the promise of everything yet to come. For the first time in both their lives, there was no exile left in either of them, only home. Winter began to loosen its hold on the valley, though it did so reluctantly, as if unwilling to yield its quiet reign. The snow sank lower each day, revealing patches of earth the color of old bark. The pines dripped steadily, their branches heavy with meltwater, and the river, once frozen solid, began to murmur again beneath a thinning crust of ice. Rylan noticed the change in Liara before the land itself began to shift. She moved differently now, lighter on her feet, her laughter frequent, but tinged with a kind of distance, like she was already listening to something far away. At first, he told himself it was nothing, just her nature calling to her as the season turned, but some part of him knew the restlessness meant something more. She had taken to standing at the edge of the clearing each morning, her tail swaying gently as she watched the horizon. Sometimes she hummed songs he didn't recognize, tunes full of melancholy and longing that didn't belong to the mountains. When he asked about them, she smiled faintly. "Old songs," she said. "We used to sing them when someone left the clan. They're meant to guide the heart back home." Her voice carried softly through the still air, but there was something in her eyes that unsettled him, an echo of farewells she hadn't spoken yet. He didn't press. Rylan wasn't a man who believed in holding people where they didn't wish to stay. Still, as he worked, mending fences, clearing the path to the river, he found himself looking toward her more often, memorizing small things, the curve of her smile, the way her tail flicked when she was thinking, the warmth that lingered in the cabin even after she left the room. The quiet he had once sought so fiercely now felt fragile, something he could lose with a single step of hers into the trees. One evening, when the sky was painted in lavender and fading gold, he found her outside near the frozen creek, crouched low to trace a pattern in the snow with her claw-tipped fingers. "What's that?" he asked, setting down the bundle of wood he'd carried. She looked up, startled, then smiled. "A memory," she said softly. "My clan marks the end of each winter by drawing what we wish to leave behind. Then we let the thaw wash it away." He watched as the faint design melted beneath her touch, a simple spiral that faded almost immediately. "What do you wish to leave behind?" he asked. Liara's eyes lingered on the fading pattern. "Fear," she said finally, "of being alone, of never being understood." She looked up at him, her expression open, vulnerable. "And you?" He hesitated, his hands tightening on the axe handle before he spoke. "Silence," he said. "It's been my shield for too long." Liara smiled, small and knowing. "Then maybe we're both learning to listen again." The words hung between them like a thread pulled taut, delicate and certain. When she stood, the last light caught her hair, and for a moment she looked less like something from the wild and more like something the world had dreamed into being. Days stretched longer, sunlight pouring into the cabin like gold spilled from the heavens. The routines they had built together grew effortless. Liara tended the hearth and the small garden plot behind the cabin, muttering softly to the seedlings as if they could hear her. Rylan split logs and fixed the roof, his movement steady and sure. Their silences became comfortable, filled with small sounds, the crackle of fire, the rustle of her tail brushing the floor, the soft hum of her voice as she worked. Sometimes, when she caught him watching, she'd tilt her head and say, "You stare too long, human," and he'd answer, "Maybe I'm trying to remember this." She'd smile then, a faint blush dusting her cheeks, but never tell him to stop. One afternoon, Liara brought him a small carving she'd made from driftwood. 2 figures, side by side, a fox and a man beneath a tree. "It's rough," she said shyly, "but it felt right." He turned it over in his hands, tracing the lines with his thumb. "It's beautiful," he said quietly. "You've got a gift." Her ears twitched in pleasure. "Foxes are storytellers," she replied. "We carve our tales when words aren't enough." "And what story's this?" he asked. She hesitated, her tail curling slowly around her feet. "One that isn't finished," she said. That night, the air outside smelled of thawing pine and earth. Rylan sat near the fire, carving a new piece of wood, while Liara mended one of his shirts by lamplight. "You ever think about going back?" he asked, keeping his tone casual, her hands stilled. "To the clan?" she said quietly. He nodded. She looked down at the thread wound around her fingers. "I used to," she admitted. "When I first arrived, I dreamed of proving them wrong, showing them that I was right to refuse my alpha. But now," she sighed softly, "now I'm not sure there's anything left to prove. I spoke my truth. They just didn't want to hear it." Rylan studied her, the light from the fire painting her in shades of gold and amber. "You sound stronger now," he said. "I don't feel strong," she replied. "Just still, like the world stopped moving when I left." "Maybe it didn't stop," he said. "Maybe you just found a place that moves slower." That drew a small smile from her, one that stayed longer than her usual fleeting ones. "Maybe," she said softly. Later, while the wind sighed through the trees, Liara hung something new above the hearth, a braided talisman woven from strands of her hair and bits of colored thread. "For the cabin," she said when he asked. "We make them to honor places that give us warmth." He looked at it, the colors glinting softly in the firelight. "You've got a gift for making things feel alive," he said. "You know that?" "I try," she said simply. Rylan smiled faintly and reached for the carving knife, turning back to the figure he'd been shaping all week, a small fox poised mid-step. Liara leaned closer, her ears tilting forward. "That's me?" "Not exactly," he said, smirking. "But close." "The tail's too short," she said, mock serious. "You're sure?" "Positive," she said, moving behind him. Her tail brushed against his arm as she leaned in, her voice a whisper near his ear. "See? You missed the flare at the tip." He swallowed, acutely aware of her nearness, the warmth of her breath, the scent of pine and smoke in her hair. "I'll fix it," he said quietly. "Good," she murmured, stepping back, though the air between them stayed charged long after she moved away. That night, as they sat together by the fire, Rylan finally finished the carving. He handed it to her without a word. "You fixed the tail," she said, smiling. "Had a good teacher," he replied. She held the figure close to her chest for a long time before setting it beside the talisman on the mantel. "Now the cabin has a soul," she said softly. The fire crackled, and Rylan leaned back, his gaze distant. "Guess that makes it official," he said. "What does?" she asked, turning toward him. "That this is home." Her ears flicked up in surprise, then softened. "Then I'm glad I found it." He wanted to tell her more, to say that she had changed the meaning of home entirely, but the words stayed locked behind his teeth. Instead, he simply nodded, eyes lingering on her face as the firelight traced the faint gold of her fur. Outside, the last breath of winter sighed through the trees, scattering a flurry of snowflakes across the thawing ground. Inside, two exiles shared the kind of silence that wasn't empty, but full, of memory, of choice, of beginnings that didn't need to be named. And when Liara finally drifted to sleep, her tail brushing softly against his leg where he sat, Rylan realized he no longer feared the coming of spring. For the first time in years, he was ready for change. Spring arrived shyly that year, the snow retreating in hesitant waves until the valley once more remembered its color. Streams broke free of their icy shells, singing through the pines with a voice both new and ancient. Buds unfurled along the lower branches, and sunlight lingered a little longer with each dawn, spilling gold across the cabin roof. The air was different now, softer, alive, and yet within that renewal came an ache Rylan could not name. Liara had begun to wander farther each morning, her steps light and thoughtful, her eyes following the distant line of the forest where the wind carried scents only she could read. He tried not to ask what she heard when she stood there listening to the trees, but the question burned quietly in his chest. He found her one morning kneeling by the garden, her hands buried in the soil. The earth clung to her fingers, dark against her pale skin, and her tail flicked lazily behind her. She was humming a tune, low and wistful, one he hadn't heard before. "That's new," he said, setting down the bucket of water he'd brought. Liara looked up, smiling faintly. "It's a growing song," she said. "My clan sang it during planting season. It helps the roots wake." "Does it work?" he asked, curious. "It depends," she replied, "on whether the singer believes in the growing." Rylan chuckled softly. "Guess that's true for people, too." She tilted her head, golden eyes shining. "You're learning our wisdom too quickly, human." "Good teacher," he said, and she laughed, the sound like sunlight itself. The following week unfolded with the slow grace of falling snow, a rhythm of quiet mornings and silver afternoons. Each day began with Rylan's steady movements around the cabin, tending to the fire or checking the traps, while Liara filled the silence with her voice, soft songs that wove through the rafters like threads of sunlight. The forest beyond remained heavy with frost, but inside, warmth had begun to root itself, subtle and deep. She moved lightly through his world, her presence a constant hum of color against the wood and stone. Sometimes she teased him, her laughter bright as sparks. Sometimes she grew still, staring into the flames as though listening to something beyond his hearing. Rylan found himself watching her more often than he meant to, and when she caught him, she only smiled knowingly, her tail curling lazily behind her like a banner of fire. One morning, the snow fell thicker than before, blanketing the cabin until the world outside became a blur of white. Rylan had gone to fetch water from the half-frozen stream when Liara appeared at the doorway, her breath fogging the air. "You humans call this living?" she asked, eyes wide with disbelief as the wind whipped around her. "This is punishment." He laughed, brushing snow from his beard. "Welcome to winter." She shivered, pulling her cloak tighter. Winter should be outlawed. When he stepped past her to shut the door, she caught his arm, her fingers cold but light. "If we're trapped here, we'll need to find ways to keep our sanity," she said, her grin sly. "You planning to drive me mad?" "It will happen naturally," she replied, and for the first time, he couldn't tell if she was joking. By evening, the storm had grown fierce, the wind howling against the walls as though some unseen creature circled the cabin. Inside, the fire burned bright, throwing gold and amber light across the walls. Rylan sat cross-legged on the floor, repairing a broken tool handle, while Liara perched near the hearth, her tail flicking idly. It brushed against his arm once, then again, too deliberate to ignore. "You doing that on purpose?" he asked without looking up. "Doing what?" she said innocently, eyes glinting. The tail flicked again. He raised a brow. "You're going to regret that," she smirked. Bold words for someone cornered indoors. He reached out suddenly, catching the tip of her tail gently. Her gasp was soft and theatrical, her ears shooting upright. "Blasphemy," she declared. "You dare touch the sacred tail of a fox queen?" He released it with a laugh. "Didn't realize I was in the presence of royalty." "Every fox is royalty in her own story," she said with mock pride. "Well, then I'm honored," he replied. "Though I'm guessing that makes me the villain." "Worse," she said. "You're the human who doesn't know better." Their laughter filled the small space, rising above the storm outside. For a man who had lived in silence for so long, Rylan found the sound addictive. Liara's laughter wasn't loud. It shimmered, the kind that warmed the cold from inside out. As the night deepened, they took turns telling stories. She spoke of clever foxes who outwitted spirits and hunters, and he told her of the city's chaos, of steel towers and endless noise. She listened with wide eyes, tail flicking thoughtfully. "Humans build cages for themselves," she murmured. "And then call it progress." He smiled faintly. "You're not wrong." Her golden gaze softened. "And yet you left. You chose silence." "I guess I did," he said. "And maybe I was tired of pretending I belonged where I didn't." "Then we are the same," she whispered. The storm lasted 3 days, the world outside reduced to swirling white. By the second morning, their food stores had dwindled to a few jars and root vegetables. Rylan spent hours keeping the fire strong, while Liara improvised meals with what little remained. When he teased her for overspicing the stew, she arched a brow. "You call that spice?" she said. "You cook like a soldier." "Efficient," he corrected. "Dull," she countered. "You humans fear flavor. We fear burning our tongues." "Then your tongues are cowards." Her grin flashed, daring him to argue. He didn't. Instead, he laughed so hard the sound startled even him. Liara's ears flicked, her smile softening as though something inside her eased at the sound. "You laugh rarely," she said quietly. "You should do it more." By the third night, the storm's rage had dulled to a slow, mournful wind. They sat near the fire, the room dim but warm. Liara leaned her back against the wall, her tail curled around her legs like a living shawl. "You ever miss them?" Rylan asked after a long silence. "Your clan." Her eyes stayed on the flames. "Sometimes," she said, "and not their rules or their pride. But the sounds, the laughter in the mornings, the smell of the forest after rain, we took those things for granted." He nodded. "The small things always go first." She turned to him. "And you? What do you miss?" He thought for a long moment. "Noise," he admitted. "Funny, right? I came here to escape it. But sometimes quiet only feels peaceful when there's someone else in it." Liara's tail stilled. "Then I'm glad I make the quiet less lonely," she said softly. Rylan's gaze lifted to hers, something deep and unsaid moving between them. "You do," he said simply. The air changed after that, subtle but undeniable. The space between them seemed smaller, filled with a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. The next morning dawned clear, sunlight spilling through the window in blinding gold. The storm had broken, leaving the world transformed, hills of untouched snow glittering like crushed glass, the forest gleaming with frost-laden stillness. Rylan opened the door to a world reborn, but before he could step out, Liara darted past him barefoot, laughing as the snow bit at her skin. "Cold!" she yelped, hopping on one foot before diving back toward the porch. "Told you," he said, smirking. She squinted up at him, tail twitching. "I don't recall you saying not to go barefoot." "I thought that part was obvious." Before he could close the door, a snowball exploded against his chest. He blinked, brushing powder from his coat. "You sure you want to start this?" Her grin was pure mischief. I already have. What followed was chaos in its purest form, white arcs of snow cutting through the air, laughter echoing through the clearing, her voice rising above it all like music. Liara moved like wildfire, quick and unpredictable, ducking behind trees and hurling snow with the precision of a hunter. Rylan was slower but deliberate, his throws perfectly timed. When one landed squarely on her shoulder, she gasped. Cheating, she cried. Accuracy, he corrected. Human trickery. Skill, he countered. Her next throw missed by inches. He retaliated, and within seconds, she was half covered in snow, shrieking with laughter. When he finally caught up to her near the frozen stream, she slipped on the ice, and he caught her instinctively, one arm wrapping around her waist. They both stilled, breath mingling, cheeks flushed from cold and something else entirely. For a heartbeat, the world shrank to the sound of their breathing and the shimmer of sunlight off the snow. Her golden eyes lifted to his, and for once, she didn't look away. You win, she whispered, though her voice trembled with amusement. Not sure I did, he murmured, his voice low. When she smiled, it wasn't her usual mischief. It was softer, uncertain, and achingly real. She slipped from his arms, brushing snow from her hair. Come on, human, she said lightly, though her cheek still burned. Let's get warm before we freeze. Inside, the cabin's heat wrapped around them like a promise. Liara knelt by the fire, shaking snow from her hair, her tail curling near the flames. Rylan watched her quietly, his chest tight with something he didn't want to name. You look like you had fun, he said. I had victory, she corrected, glancing back with a grin. Fun was just a side effect. Could have fooled me. She stood and stepped closer, close enough that the air between them hummed with warmth. You laughed, she said softly. You don't do that often. Guess I forgot how, he replied. Then I'll remind you again soon. Her hand rose, brushing his cheek, fingers warm against his skin. There, she murmured. Now you look alive. He stayed still, afraid to break the fragile moment. Her eyes lingered on his for a breath longer than necessary before she turned away, pretending to fuss with the stew pot. But when she spoke again, her voice carried something unsteady. Dinner will be ready soon, she said. He smiled faintly, knowing she needed the space. Still, he couldn't stop glancing toward her as she moved. How her tail swayed, how her hair glowed in the firelight. She was no longer the shivering stranger he'd met in the snow. She was something far more dangerous. Belonging. That night, as the fire burned low, Liara sat cross-legged near the hearth, weaving something from a thin strip of leather and colored threads. Another charm? Rylan asked, leaning forward. No, she said. I promise not. For moments, that shouldn't fade. She tied it neatly and held it up to the light. Like your face when I buried you in snow. He groaned, smiling despite himself. You're never letting that go, are you? Never, she said proudly. Then, quieter. It's a good memory. Later, as the storm's remnants whispered through the trees, Rylan lay awake, the faint sound of her breathing steady beside the fire. He thought of her laughter, her stories, the way her presence had softened every edge of his solitude. The cabin no longer felt like a fortress against the world. It felt like the beginning of one. He smiled into the darkness, listening to the soft crackle of flames and the rustle of her tail. Somewhere between exile and peace, he realized he had stopped being alone. The forest slumbered under winter's silver breath, each pine heavy with frost and silence. A single man moved among the sleeping giants, his breath rising in soft clouds as he dragged a bundle of split logs toward his waiting sled. Rylan Corvin had long since grown used to the solitude of the mountains. His world measured in the sound of axes striking wood, the crunch of snow beneath boots, and the steady rhythm of his own thoughts. But that morning the rhythm faltered. From somewhere behind him came the faintest shift of sound, a pattern of steps that did not belong to his. He turned sharply, axe in hand, and froze. Between the skeletal trees stood a woman, her fiery hair a defiant bloom against the gray-blue hush. Ears, not human, but sharply furred and russet, tilted atop her head, catching the weak light like embers struggling to live. For a breath neither spoke. The air itself seemed to hold still, as though waiting to see who would move first. The stranger's cloak was dusted in white, her gloved hands clasped tightly before her chest. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and melodic, carrying the trembling grace of a string pulled just short of breaking. Forgive me, she murmured. I didn't mean to trespass. I didn't realize this was your territory. Rylan blinked, his expression breaking into a low, rough chuckle that rolled through the quiet like gravel under boots. Territory? He said. I don't own the forest. It belongs to itself. I'm just borrowing space for the winter. The woman's golden eyes softened, flicking briefly toward his face before returning to the ground. Oh, you're human, she said, almost to herself. And yet you don't speak like most who meet my kind. I've met a few fox spirits before, he said, lowering the axe, but not his guard. Most were tricksters more than travelers. Her tail, a sleek arc of burnished red, flicked once behind her, glowing like flame in the pale light. We are spirited, she admitted, her lips curving faintly. But not all trouble. He studied her more closely now, the sharp lines of her face softened by exhaustion and cold. She was slender, graceful, yet her trembling hands betrayed the toll of distance and hunger. "What brings a fox spirit this far north alone?" he asked finally. She hesitated, snow gathering on her lashes, before she whispered the single word, "Exile." Ryland frowned, the word hanging in the air like a wound left open. "Exiled? For what crime?" The woman's gaze lifted, fierce now, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "For saying no." The simplicity of it struck him harder than he expected. She went on, each word burning in the cold. "I defied my clan's alpha. He wished to court me. I refused. Among Vulpines, refusal is defiance. I could fight him for the title or leave. I chose the road." Her golden eyes caught the faint light like fire trapped in amber. "My name is Liara," she said, her chin lifting in quiet pride. "Daughter of the Dawnclaw clan." Ryland rested the axe on his shoulder, his expression thoughtful. "You don't look like a fighter," he said. Liara gave a wry smile, small but unbroken. "Then perhaps I chose wisely." He nodded, glancing at her thin cloak and the frost beginning to gather at its edges. "You've been walking long?" She glanced toward the horizon. "Since morning, maybe longer. The forest is kinder than my people today." Ryland exhaled through his nose, the sound half amusement, half disbelief. "Well, that's not saying much. You look half frozen." He adjusted his grip on the axe and jerked his chin toward the trees. "My cabin's not far. There's stew on the fire and a roof if you want to thaw before moving on." Her ears twitched, torn between instinct and need. Ryland caught the hesitation and shrugged. "Your choice," he said simply. That word seemed to settle something in her. "You humans love that word," she said softly, but a small smile broke through as she stepped forward. "Then I choose dinner." Together they moved through the snow, the silence between them no longer empty but curious. The forest seemed gentler somehow, as though holding its breath to listen. When the cabin appeared, a squat shape half buried in drifts, its chimney breathing thin smoke, Liara stopped, eyes wide. "You live here alone?" she asked quietly. 3 years, Ryland replied. "Closest neighbor's a good 5 miles off. Keeps things peaceful." He opened the door and gestured for her to enter. "Go on in. It's warmer than it looks." Liara stepped inside and was immediately swallowed by heat and scent, the rich smell of stew, the soft crackle of firelight. Her ears flicked toward the hearth, the golden tips catching the glow. The cabin was small but alive. Wooden beams darkened with age, shelves lined with hand-carved trinkets, a faded blanket thrown across the chair nearest the fire. "It's peaceful," she said after a pause. "You say that now," Ryland replied with a grin. "Wait till the wind starts howling." He hung his coat and motioned toward the table. "Sit. You look like you could use something hot." She obeyed, folding her tail neatly around her knees as she sat. When Ryland set a bowl before her, the steam rose between them in slow, spiraling ribbons. Liara hesitated, then leaned closer, sniffing delicately. "This smells strange," she said. "That's meat and potatoes," he replied. "Not much else grows up here." Her nose wrinkled faintly, but after a small sip, her eyes widened in surprise. "It's good," she murmured. Ryland chuckled. "You sound shocked." She tilted her head, her tail swaying lazily. "I've never tasted human cooking like this. It's simple, but honest." He leaned back, arms crossed. "Simple's the best kind of meal. Fancy ones tend to go cold before you can enjoy them." For a while they ate in silence, broken only by the soft hum of fire and wind. When Liara finally spoke again, her voice was thoughtful. "You said you live alone. Don't you ever tire of the quiet?" Ryland's expression softened. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but the noise out there is worse. This way, I only answer to the trees." Her lips quirked at that, half amusement, half sadness. "You sound like a fox." He smiled faintly. "Guess I've spent too long listening to the wild." Her gaze drifted toward the fire, her reflection shimmering in the light. "My kind believes silence is dangerous," she said quietly. "It hides predators and truth. But lately I wonder if it can also hold peace." Ryland nodded slowly, watching her as she stared into the flames. "It depends who you share it with," he said. She looked up at him, and something unspoken passed between them, a fragile understanding born of exile and endurance. When her eyes began to droop, he stood and gestured toward the narrow bed near the wall. "You should rest," he said. "I'll keep the fire going." She shook her head quickly. "I can't take your bed." He smiled faintly. "You can. Don't argue." For a long moment she studied him, then relented, curling onto the cot with her cloak still wrapped around her. "You're kind, Ryland Corvin," she murmured. He chuckled. "Don't spread rumors." But when she fell asleep, her tail coiled softly by her side, the cabin didn't feel so empty anymore. Morning came pale and slow. Frost glimmered on the window panes, and the forest beyond gleamed white as polished bone. Ryland moved quietly, stoking the fire, the smell of smoke and coffee rising into the air. He turned just in time to see Liara's ears twitch beneath the blanket. "Morning," he said. "You snore." Her eyes snapped open, indignant. "I do not." "You do," he teased, grinning. "Barely, but it's there." She muttered something in her native tongue that sounded suspiciously like a curse before sitting up. Humans are bold in the morning, she said. Just honest, he replied, handing her a mug of steaming tea. Over the next few days, an easy rhythm settled between them. Liara swept the hearth, mended torn blankets, and tried unsuccessfully to split firewood. When the axe slipped and buried itself in the snow, she glared at it as if betrayed by the tool itself. Rylan laughed for the first time in weeks. You're improving, he said, if the goal was to frighten the logs. She huffed, her tail flicking in indignation. No, I adapt quickly, she said, and you have fed me like royalty. I should at least try to earn my keep. You've done more talking in 3 days than I've done all winter, he said. That's worth something. Her eyes sparkled at that. Then I'll keep talking, and she did. Liara spoke of her people, of moonlit festivals, clever songs, and stories of foxes who tricked wolves into fetching their dinner. Rylan listened, asking quiet questions that made her pause and smile. Why follow one alpha? He asked once. Seems like trouble waiting to happen. She shrugged, sewing a patch into his coat. We were taught that strength keeps us safe, but strength without compassion becomes fear. He nodded slowly. Guess that's true for humans, too. Different names, same mistake. That night, she sat by the window, her tail curled neatly around her feet as snow whispered outside. I used to fear silence, she said softly. It meant danger. Now it feels kind. Rylan stood nearby, watching her reflection in the glass. Silence isn't empty, he said. Sometimes it's just waiting for something worth hearing. She turned, eyes shining in the lamplight. And what do you hear now? He smiled, low and steady. You. Her breath caught just slightly before she turned back toward the window, pretending not to notice the warmth coloring her cheeks. Yet that night, when she finally drifted to sleep by the fire, Rylan realized something had changed. The sound of her breathing, soft and steady, had become the rhythm he didn't know he'd been missing. Outside, the wind swept through the pines like a lullaby. And for the first time in years, he didn't dream of solitude. He dreamed of golden eyes in the snow.